When Jesus first began to speak in church, people were just amazed. You see, they thought he was just a carpenter. But quite apart from Jesus being the divine word in human form, he was more than a carpenter. I suggest there were things about his past the people weren't aware of, just like us. You see, there's a gap in his life story from when he was 12 to when he's 27 years old. I mean, if you were hiring him to work in your company, you'd want to know what he was doing in those years. Or if you were dating someone you found very attractive, you know, that falling in love feeling, hours of talking and finding out more and more about them. If the same gap of years was never talked about, you'd be left wondering, what is it I'm not supposed to know? People wonder why I like to delve into this stuff. Well, I want to know all I can about this one I've fallen in love with. Some people are afraid I'll find out stuff that we're not meant to know, like things that could destroy our faith. They make statements like, I've got my Bible, that is all I need. It is sort of a fear that new information might unsettle us or shake our faith. I don't have that fear. This fear is not new. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered, those in charge made sure that the writings didn't get into the hands of ordinary people. It took nearly 50 years before they were all made available for scholars to translate and to argue about. The mainstream church pushed back on anything that challenged the accepted thinking. I call it putting God in a box, and a small one at that. Listening to scholars talk about the scrolls, I am fully persuaded God had a hand in preserving them, so that over time they would enable us to get a better picture of God and his work in the world, to make a bigger box, so to speak. I mean the miracle of earthen jars with ancient writings inside, thrown into caves by panic-stricken Jews after the fall of Jerusalem and preserved by layer upon layer of bat dung, completely sealing even the broken jars. I don't think that's just good luck. So what do the scrolls say that rattles the church? It seems quite a lot, mainly by being written before and during the time of Jesus. It is what scholars call source material, and more accurate than material from later recollection and uncertainty over authenticity and authorship. This poses a dilemma when the writings differ from the version held to be divinely inspired. This poses a direct threat to the inerrancy of Scripture idea, striking fear into people that need certainty. Another thing that rattles the church is the suggestion that John the Baptist, Jesus and his brother James were clearly influenced by the central themes of the writings. The church views this a more serious threat in that it suggests that these major figures had preparation of some sort for their respective roles. They prefer to present Jesus, at least, as a quiet carpenter that mysteriously appears fully equipped for his amazing preaching and healing mission. I don't claim that Jesus was an Essene, the sect that wanted to preserve their sacred library of ancient writings and wrote many of the scrolls coming from the Qumran community. I am fully persuaded, however, that Jesus, his cousin John and his brother James belonged to a related sect known as the Nazareans, from the Hebrew word natsar, meaning primitive root, to guard or to watch over. Although the Gospel writer Matthew writes of a prophecy of Jesus, he shall be called a Nazarene, this doesn't appear in the Hebrew version, nor is there a town called Nazareth in antiquity. Similarly, the references in Acts to the sect of the Nazarenes gives rise to the idea that early believers were followers of Jesus of Nazareth, meaning his boyhood town. It's more likely to mean the sect of the ancient Nazareans. To be sure, Jesus is not mentioned in the scroll, so we cannot be sure about those missing years. But we can compare the writings of these sects with Jesus' words, and when this comparison is made, one is not left in any doubt whatsoever. Verse after verse in the primary source material, in many instances Jesus quoted it word for word. As a teacher, Jesus had surely been taught and prepared by the best teachers of his day, prepared for his role of ultimate teacher of righteousness. As well as teaching from their ancient library, the sects also placed health and healing as paramount. Their dietary laws were strict, as were requirements for regular fasting and personal purity of mind and body. Members of the community progressed through various levels, not unlike passing exams, only much more demanding. The final exam, for instance, was a 40-day fast in the wilderness, with survival dependent entirely on the student's capacity to engage with the angels. Clearly not your regular college exam. You see, the Essenes and the Nazarenes had a high regard for Enoch more than Moses, and as such were well versed in the role of angelic beings, the good ones and the bad ones, the role they play in everyday affairs. We have an account of Jesus going through this demanding final test before starting his mission. His engagement with Lucifer himself being offered things anyone else would find impossible to resist, and proving his familiarity with the good angels by the ministering unto him. He passed the test. If it came to familiarity with angels, I'm not sure many of us would pass. Our sacred texts have them in the margin, not on the same page. Perhaps the most profound implication of Jesus being influenced by these Jewish sects is their refusal to sacrifice animals. They claim God never commanded burnt offerings and sacrifices at all, and that much of what those laws are about is fiction. What God requires, according to their thinking, is getting along with others and providing for the widows, orphans, and the poor, as well as the stranger. It is not surprising that Jesus released the animals about to be slaughtered, bringing much chaos and displeasure from the moneymakers. It also releases us from the idea of God as deity, requiring sacrifice of us or bad stuff will happen. That God can be discarded, box and all. I refer to the Essenes and the Nazarenes, but there were many more Jewish sects at the time of Jesus and existing during the rise of the early church. The various discoveries in other caves confirms this, and scholars are keen to identify which were the ones that were influenced by Jesus' teaching and message for life. I find this interesting. The yardstick they use to identify the Jesus movement is, do they love their enemies or not? This is the one identifying feature that sets Jesus' followers apart from any other group. In those times, identifying the enemy was easy, loving them wasn't. All sects of the time failed this test. I suspect many would be if applied to the church today. However, there were followers of Jesus that took his message to heart, and they loved their enemies. And a surprising thing happened. They finished up having no enemies. Plenty of people didn't like them. They treated them badly and even killed them. But it didn't change their commitment to this central idea. I say central because their lives demonstrated that getting along with others and looking after those less fortunate was what God preferred over bloodshed, going with the grain of God, so to speak. And they were able to embrace the idea of no us and them, all family. Curiously enough, even the Samaritans. Yes, even the Samaritans, those shameful members of the family we have nothing to do with. They too only appear in the margin of our sacred text, but it is these people that more than any other get the Christian show on the road. lower class, illiterate and poor, when they embraced the one who promised upon being crucified would bring all people to himself and into a relationship with a God they had never known, a God moreover that had made everything right with humankind, revealing to them their true identity as loved children, and assuring them of their place in the grand narrative of all people being ultimately made whole and complete. No wonder they call this good news, and no wonder it spread. Yes, it spread. The early church saw phenomenal growth such as the world had never seen, hinted at in our sacred text, but in fact the rise took place more in spite of what we read rather than because of it. You see, the defining characteristic, I maintain, of the early church, the true Jesus movement, was their commitment to loving and having no enemies. And more than that, having been sold on the idea of ultimate restoration for all, meant the idea of salvation, some saved and others not, did not distract their leaders and stunt the growth of their church movement. I say distracted intentionally, for marginalising the defining characteristic of loving your enemies and bringing to centre stage the idea of salvation, ways of defining who is in and who is out, how to get saved and what happens if you don't. These distractions have hijacked the purity and the simplicity of Jesus' original message of sin dealt with and the world reconciled. Not unlike the distraction of slaughtering animals instead of helping each other. Yes, I know why people are fearful of delving into stuff. For if the scrolls tell us anything, it is that there is more to the story than what we've been told. And told to ignore the gap in the resume. And don't worry about the years of our lover we know nothing about. And to keep our notion of God in the box provided. Yeah, perhaps that's the best, but not for this old bloke. He believes that God has yet further things to reveal to us for this age.